Previously, we looked at Godzilla, the original Godzilla film that was as much a film about the essential union between science and morality as it was about giant devastating monsters. Well, no pun intended, but Godzilla was a smash hit, and was quickly followed up by a sequel. But then 7 years later, Godzilla exploded into a film franchise when he fought his cinematic ancestor with King Kong vs. Godzilla, and then began battling a whole collection of other monsters on what was often an annual basis until 1975. But along the way, something happened that changed the nature of Godzilla. He became the good guy. You could perhaps consider that the atomic nature of Godzilla was allegorical for America and an indication that, while once a menace to Japan, he was now an ally, but I doubt that that was the case. It's far more likely that Mothra, which came out the year before Godzilla vs. King Kong, was the real influence. Mothra was destructive, sure, but it was devoid of the unfeeling and pointless rampage of Godzilla from the original film. Mothra was seen as a more benevolent force that allowed the audience to root for the monster. Doing the same with Godzilla would surely be a good way to increase the monster's popularity, yes? Well, yes and no. But first, let's talk about the other Godzilla movie. Not the sequel, the one in that 7-year period between Godzilla films, Godzilla King of the Monsters. Until relatively recently, this was actually the only way most Americans could even see Godzilla. Now, that film has got a somewhat negative reputation because it was an Americanization of Godzilla. And in cultural terms, Americanization gives it the connotation of being processed like some kind of cheese-like substitute. And of course, it gets in the way of the original intent of the film in some places. But a couple essential things need to be remembered. First, Godzilla had already been shown in the United States. That's how it was brought to the attention of Edmund Goldman. He saw it in a Chinatown theater with subtitles and was so impressed that he bought the rights to it. It wasn't the original version that forever put the image of Godzilla into America's popular culture. It was King of the Monsters. And that is significant, not only because of its assimilation into our popular consciousness, but also because it addressed a fear in Japan of how their nation was being perceived in the post-war world stage. They lost the war, remember, and thus in the rest of the world they were seen as the vanquished villain. And the positive things around the world accepted about Japan were the likes of films by Kurosawa, which were frequently set in Japan's feudal past. That has an impact. Say Greece, and images of its classic age are what most often come to mind. Or mention Egypt, and it's the days of the pharaohs and the building of the pyramids. So too could Japan have become trapped in a cultural perception as either vanquished menace or quaint image of its feudal days, when what Japan wanted was to be respected as a modern nation. Godzilla may have put the image of Japanese people fleeing from giant reptiles into America's collective consciousness, but those crowds were modern people in modern cities shown to live relatable lives, when they weren't running for their lives. While I understand the ongoing sub versus dub debate among fans of anime and other Japanese works, the fact is that in America, subtitled films were rarely successful. Even the world-renowned Rashomon, which was the most successful Japanese film outside of Japan, brought in less than half the money over its entire American run than the budget of an episode of Game of Thrones, even adjusted for inflation. And before you're ready with the stereotype of stupid Americans too lazy to read subtitles, it was an issue of distribution. Many of the theaters were unwilling to show a subtitled film, a problem that still exists today. Of course, if Americans wanted to see it, the demand would be there, but it's a vicious circle. Theaters show few subtitled films because Americans rarely watch them, and Americans rarely watch them because theaters show so few of them. So, if they wanted a chance to hit it big in America, a film needed to be dubbed. And it should be pointed out that this wasn't Americans insisting on covering the beautiful original language and performances with their own talentless performers. This was at the insistence of the Japanese studios in many cases. In fact, they were forcing the issue sometimes against the objections of American distributors because dubbing costs money. Sometimes it could be 10 times the rights of the film itself. Dubbing was not seen as some mutilation of the film at this time. No, it was a sign of respect. You believed in a film so strongly that you'd invest even more money into it because you believed it was a great film that everybody needed to see. And Goldman believed in Godzilla so strongly that he paid $25,000 for it. A small-sounding figure perhaps, but it was more than 8 times the going rate for similar films from Japan. He partnered up with several others who became so impressed that not only did they want to see this brought to America, they wanted it dubbed. It was that good. It was worth it. And then they brought in Joseph Levine to invest even further in the film. Now, Levine had bucked conventional wisdom by going for mainstream releases of Italian art films, which succeeded because he had them dubbed, going 3 for 3 and creating final versions that broke the $1 million mark in America, something that no one thought was possible. And yes, I said art films, and his next pick was Godzilla, a point that we should keep in mind. If you suggest that Citizen Kane is just the story of a rich, arrogant jerk, you're unsophisticated. But if you suggest that Godzilla examines deep questions of morality with a strong allegory, you'll be laughed at for defending a monster movie. So with Levine backing the project, they decided to go one better and add the Americanization elements to it, and give it even more widespread appeal. And as Terry Morse worked on the film, he gained a healthy respect for it. It may seem like they hacked up the movie to turn a cheap buck, but believe me, they weren't. This was a sign that they wanted this film to be as big a success as possible. Yes, they were still trying to make a profit on it, obviously, but they weren't trying to do it by dumbing the film down. They were trying to get even more people interested in seeing what an incredible movie this was. This brings us to a connection that you probably would never imagine I would say. The film's connection to noir. I know, that sounds insane. A noir Godzilla film sounds like a Family Guy gag. What I mean is that, rather than the atmosphere being noir, it was the way in which it was repackaged. It was written by Al C. Ward and directed by Morse, who would then edit the film. Now, Terry Morse was known for 2 things: his low-budget crime films and being an effective film doctor. A man whose job it was to rescue dying films from poor preview screenings or doomed productions. And it required skill as both a director and editor, which was not something that was very common in Hollywood at that time. But a film doctor needed to often refilm and re-edit a work in order to try to salvage it. So to bring Godzilla to America and do it justice, a skilled film doctor was needed who could stay true to the original film but make it ready for American audiences. He used the noir ideas because they were effective ways to keep the costs down. Things like narration, which can be useful in establishing scenes with minimal cost, getting out necessary background information to wallpaper over the bits you don't have, and also to establish atmosphere. With that idea in mind, they need an American in the film to serve as the audience viewpoint character, to provide the narration and observe the events. A reporter. And that man was played by the great Raymond Burr. Burr would go on to be recognized as one of the exceptional actors of the 20th century, but at this time, he was practically a nobody. Burr was a giant of a man, tall and physically imposing. Despite being a highly skilled actor, he was often being typecast as a thug. He was most famous to the world at this time, not as Perry Mason, but as the monster who murdered his wife in Hitchcock's Rear Window. Well, it was natural that Morse, with his background in crime dramas, remember, would tap someone that he knew was talented, professional, and desperate for a chance to break out of the rut. But while Burr was the American centerpiece of the film, it's important to note that he is not shoehorned into the film as the hero. No, he's a victim. The first time we see him is amidst the wreckage of Tokyo. And while he is the viewpoint character for American audiences, the view that he has of the Japanese people, and thus the one that the audience shares, is one of respect for those people. This is not to say that there is nothing that might be racially offensive here. The Japanese dialogue created for the American version is, per the American filmmaking experience of the time, nothing but people babbling nonsense sounds. Still, It should also be remembered that this is the mid-50s. Just a decade after this was the image Americans had been bombarded with of Japan as subhuman rapist monsters. Joseph Levine himself contributed to this during the war with his importation of anti-Japanese propaganda films. In contrast, though, Raymond Burr's character treated all of the Japanese people like they were regular people. These weren't silly foreigners to be laughed at for their ethnic antics and treated as bonus points when the monster kills them. It told the American audiences that the people living their lives, falling in love, fighting the good fight, were just like them, to make the tragedy come home when Godzilla would go upon his rampage. It's especially notable that this respect applied not just to the citizens of Japan, but to that very enemy the propaganda was painting as a trollish beast. As film historian and Godzilla scholar David Callett notes, the Japanese army itself is not only shown valiantly trying to defend innocent people, the action shown in Godzilla King of the Monsters paints them, if anything, to be even more valiant. The vicious, bloodthirsty enemy had become the tragic hero. That is not to say that there aren't deficiencies in the film. The inserted American material is conspicuously inferior to the original print in terms of film quality. And in addition to having Japanese dialogue be gibberish, a character is pronounced dead and then is seen several times afterwards alive and well, implying at best sloppy editing, and at worst, the racist assumption that Americans wouldn't be able to tell Japanese actors apart anyway. And the historical allegory becomes lost in an effort to make things easier for the American audiences to follow. But nevertheless, Godzilla King of the Monsters was such a successful transformation in America that it wound up being translated into other languages to be shown elsewhere, including, hilariously, Japan itself. Thanks in part to this film, Burr was able to take the role that he would be made famous for, Perry Mason, and Godzilla King of the Monsters would see numerous repeats on American television. And it should be remembered that the film respected the tragedy of the deaths seen in the original. That people running away wasn't comedy. It was relatable human desperation. It would be later films that would lead to the joke. And ironically, the films Japan itself was making. This continues with that yes and no from before that I'd mentioned. Was Godzilla's movement to hero good or bad for his popularity? Yes, in that the Godzilla franchise took off, and not just the numerous films over the next 14 years. In 1977, Marvel began a Godzilla comic book that included guest appearances by their heroes. And Hanna-Barbera created an animated show where Godzilla was an ally to the heroes. And also included odious comic relief Godzuki, because Hanna-Barbera will always be Hanna-Barbera. But all of this had done one other thing for Godzilla. It slid him more into being exactly what the sneering critics had said, a big monster meant to amuse children. Godzilla vs. Megalon is one of the films that helped to cement this reputation in America, with a lambasting by critics and a primetime television release hosted by John Belushi in a Godzilla costume, doing skits and generally making fun of the film. And if that shame wasn't great enough, the film gained even further ridicule when it appeared in Season 2 of Mystery Science Theater 3000, which showcased how ridiculous things had gotten. King of the Monsters may have had deficiencies, but it had done nothing like the damage that the films themselves were now doing. There was no conscious decision to halt Godzilla films. Toho was just suddenly rejecting script after script for the film, until it became clear that it was because the franchise just needed a break. Until finally, almost a decade later, the next film would be The Return of Godzilla. As so often happens when a franchise hits a problem, it's time for a reboot. It was decided that Godzilla needed to go back to his roots, away from the giant cockroaches and flying robots. So Tanaka essentially wiped away the films after the original from the canon of the franchise and started over. It wasn't promising. Tsuburaya had passed away, Honda was disillusioned after the creative interference that he'd had on his last Godzilla film, and Ifukube was annoyed with the deterioration of the series over the later years. He commented that he didn't score 80-meter monster movies. the new Godzilla having grown an additional 30 meters, which also played havoc with the miniatures because they need to be scaled down since the actors are basically going to be the same size. But the result of this work was the film The Return of Godzilla, a darker, more serious film that was a successful relaunch that would continue for well over a decade. We are not here to talk about that film. No, today we are looking at the decision with this reboot of all but the first film to do the same thing in America that had been done with that film, which would result in the film Godzilla 1985. To understand the train wreck that followed, let's start with the fundamental difference between Japan's theater system and America's. In Japan, the studios own the theaters, while in America, because of antitrust laws, the studios aren't allowed to own their own theaters. That meant for Toho that they not only had to share profits with the American distributor, but also with the American theaters, which were going to take a sizable portion of the box office. So Toho shopped around for an independent distributor that'd pay them what they felt that this was worth, which leads us to the infamous Roger Corman. Now don't worry, he didn't directly get involved in this. See, in the 70s, Corman created New World Pictures with his brother Gene after Corman had left American International to continue his tradition of making films on shoestring budgets so that in the end he'd make lots of money with his tried and true method of violence and boobs. Well, New World consistently made a profit with this plan. So in 1983, Corman sold it to KotM and Sloan, who proceeded to screw it all up. So they brought in Robert Remy, who would go on to produce Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, and he would handle New World. Robert Remy is also the man who would later purchase Marvel Comics for New World, which, to show how well he grasped the product that he was buying, announced triumphantly, "Gentlemen, we just bought Superman." To which one of his subordinates said, "No, Bob, we bought Spider-Man." To which a horrified Remy yelled, and I quote, "Holy shit, we've got to stop this." But before that were to happen, Remy needed to turn things around at New World. They were in big trouble. So he felt that Godzilla was a good bet. By this time, Godzilla had been perceived now as something for children and for fans of exploitation flicks. And since exploitation was where New World was making its money, it seemed like they would go very well together. Godzilla was, after all, universally known for having nothing new to offer people save one monster fighting another, and now there was a brand new one out there. They figured this was just going to be more of the same. So he offered Toho $500,000 for the new Godzilla film. A bit on the low side, but this company was birthed by Corman. Did you expect a lot more? Yes? Well, good, because more is what we've got. Because of the 30th anniversary of the original film, Dr. Pepper already had a deal to include Godzilla in an ad campaign for their soda. Well, New World heard the sound of dollar signs and quickly met with the Dr. Pepper people, resulting in this ridiculous plan. Like the original, they were going to add on a bunch of American scenes to try to make it more marketable. Unlike the original, Dr. Pepper would pay for it. In return, they'd promised to feature Dr. Pepper prominently throughout the movie. Appropriate since Dr. Pepper's almost as harmful to flesh as the oxygen destroyer from the first film. But what parlayed that move into a win instead of a disaster was bringing on board Raymond Burr to replay the original role. He'd only have to shoot for a day, he'd get top billing, a big paycheck, and he was intrigued at the idea of reprising a character 30 years later. No coincidence, then, that he had also returned to the role of Perry Mason, which meant that New World had their star already traveling around to talk about a project, so all they had to do was just ask him, "Hey, while you're on Carson, why don't you slip in a little Godzilla mention there?" The amusing problem that they faced with the character, though, was that, well, it was originally done in the 50s. They were just going for some kind of American everyman observer, some regular Joe, so they gave him a simple and easy-to-remember name that would be completely unremarkable. Well, the name they happened to pick was Steve Martin. And keep in mind, this is 1985, when the comedian Steve Martin was still at the peak of his fame. Back-to-back Grammys for comedy albums, hit film after hit film. Even though the character had been named when Steve Martin was still in grade school, it'd be like some obscure character from some old movie or TV show that just happened to be named Benedict Cumberbatch or Robert Downey Jr. or something, was being used and just saying, oh, we're not banking on their recent success, it's just a coincidence. Well, even though they would probably win any lawsuit, New World was willing to give us The Pentagon, brought to you by Dr. Pepper. So, avoiding any trip into the court was important to them. So, for the entire film, Raymond Burr's character would only be referred to by his last name. You could never use his first name. And if you did call him that, he'd have to show you his technique for turning straw into gold. The presence of Burr would have a profound effect on the American scenes. The original concept had been that the Pentagon would be the center of a Dr. Strangelove-like activity and was written with lots of comedy to marry with the Godzilla material. And it was thought that someone like Leslie Nielsen would be hired to help with that. But getting Raymond Burr to return was too good of an opportunity for them to pass up on. And that was when they learned something that they really didn't expect. Raymond Burr liked Godzilla. He was proud of the film that he had done. And practically the first thing that he did when he showed up was to tell them that Godzilla is a symbol of the nuclear menace to mankind. There's nothing funny about atomic genocide, even if it was in the form of a giant reptile. So the direction was substantially changed, leaving just one odious comic relief character, while other people had serious but ultimately drab dialogue. While King of the Monsters had certainly stepped on the allegory somewhat, Godzilla 1985 was ready to go much farther. According to director R.J. Kaiser, they had 4 mandates for changes. Godzilla should appear sooner rather than later, get rid of any hokey special effects, tighten up the run time, and ensure that they removed anything that made America look bad, and emphasize that the Russians are awful. In fact, one of the new shots would completely reverse the original intent of a scene. Instead of a Russian sailor trying and failing to stop the launch of a nuclear missile, he was struggling with his dying breath to launch it. New World's audience was far more of the Red Dawn camp, so it's hardly surprising that they made sure that the commies were the bad guys, while dubious American leaders are edited to appear like the good guys. So I think by now you're probably getting the picture. While Godzilla King of the Monsters Americanized the classic, it arguably tried its best to remain true to its anti-atomic weapons subtext and the moral issues being considered. It made an effort to respect its Japanese cast and the culture and setting of the film, and it worked to make the new material fit as seamlessly as possible, brought to America by those experienced in foreign art films. Godzilla 1985 would strip out or distort much of the Cold War and anti-nuclear elements of the film. It undermined the tragedy of the film by cracking jokes at terrified Japanese people dying. Its material was intrusive and filled with ads for soda, and brought to America by those experienced in films about horny student nurses. Tomato, tomato. Well, let's take a look at the result of all of this. It's Godzilla 1985.